My research straddles international relations and moral and political philosophy. So it really addresses the ethical dimension of international relations, which I think is incredibly important. One of the things that I've looked at in my research recently, which is perhaps more controversial, is suggesting the coalition of the willing, that sort of model, as a body that might respond to particular crises in international politics. Sometimes we do have a situation where there's a crisis, whether that crisis be mass atrocity crimes or even climate change, and our formal organizations, which I think are incredibly important, fail. So we might have the United Nations that's unable to act in a particular context. For example, there might be the vetoes exercised in the Security Council. We have a crisis that needs to be addressed. And I think in those cases that we can talk about a coalition of the willing, or what I might like to say, a coalition of the obligated, to deliberate and negotiate and coordinate some effective course of action in response to some crisis. I suppose you could turn on the news at the moment and think things aren't going very well. There's not much hope. Actors aren't discharging their responsibilities if we look at what's happening in Aleppo, in Syria, for example. And yet I think there actually is reason to be hopeful. The responsibility to protect is borne by the international community, and all member states of the United Nations signed up to this responsibility in 2005 at the World Summit. And I think there is an evolving norm to protect vulnerable populations from mass atrocity crimes. So I think there's reason to be hopeful, but it's also a really important area to study and do work on. Speak to politicians or policymakers, my hope is that there is an impact there. But one thing that I find really rewarding is that my students who are officer cadets, when I speak to them about this work as well, I think that that has a real practical relevance for them. So when I'm talking about the responsibility to protect, for example, what's happening in Syria, going back to Iraq in 2003, my students are deeply interested in this because it's going to affect them directly in what they do over the next few years.